Justice Studies Department. And when an issue is as important to you as this has come to me, the last thing you want is for your research to be read by 3 professors and then sit on a shelf for all of eternity. So it's really a privilege to be sharing it with you all today, people who can actually maybe do something with it. So the process was that I interviewed 18 of Arizona's foundation leaders. Many of them are in the room, so thank you. Some of you this might be familiar. You might hear yourself in these quotes. I was interested in what role funders see for themselves in achieving structural change. I had a research Carol in the department and overheard a professor talking with a student a few summers ago about an issue of global human rights, and it was through a door and I was eavesdropping, so I didn't hear everything. I suspect it had to do with drought and water, because that was this professor's interest. And the student must have said something about one of the large international relief aid groups that often come in circumstances like this, because what the professor said was, well, being a charity is not going to solve this problem. And this assumption about the purpose of foundations and charitable organizations got me thinking and wondering whether that's true, wondering whether philanthropists saw their role as upstream, to use the old parable about babies falling in the river, or downstream, pulling them out. So this research questions here really get at that central dilemma facing philanthropy of where to invest your significant but still finite resources, especially in the context of your needs. And just before sharing the findings, I just want to give a caveat that this research was done in the winter, the end of 2010, early 2011, and obviously there's been a lot of new interest in this, given the room size today, so I might have gotten different answers now. And also, this was really at the height of the recession when we were seeing increased community needs, decreases in government's investments in the social structure, and then fewer assets of yours to go around as well. So there was sort of a pull back downstream, perhaps at the expense of other types of giving. So that's just some context. The resounding answer that I got was yes. Arizona funders want to engage in the type of meaningful philanthropy that does more than just place Band-Aids over social ills. And this really is representative of the sector's evolution from a traditional charitable framework that's short-term, immediate need, that's reactive, to the modern philanthropic framework, which is looking more at long-term social change and is more proactive. And here are just a sample of some of the quotes that I heard. Things about somebody who's really specifically said he wanted to be that guy running upstream, that wanted to be more systemic, people suggesting with the leverage that there's no area where they can do more good with limited resources than in the area of advocacy, and then people challenging that there may be even more potential than we're seeing to drive an agenda that's bigger than simply grant making. And I think these quotes reflect the reform agenda that's inherent in philanthropy that also lends itself to public policy work. But the people I interviewed identified multiple constraints towards working upstream. Some of them included this channeling of philanthropic resources towards basic needs as a result of the recession. Also, what they felt was governmental infringement on their autonomy. This more than one person who said they felt some resentment that government expected them to fill the gap that was created when government pulled back during the recession. And then also this orientation that prioritizes short-term programs with measurable results that we can see relatively quickly, that's at odds to these longer-term efforts. And I think this afternoon the panel is going to talk a little bit about how we can measure, and we heard some of that already from Aaron. And then the fourth point was a whole variety of obstacles to engaging in public policy and advocacy, and that's specifically what I will talk about now. So while many agreed that engagement with public policy can and should serve as a tool in the toolbox, there was also sort of split down the middle on whether folks thought the sector was doing that, actually. And it's just as one indicator, the first question that I began each interview with was, how do you define philanthropy? And of the 18, only 2 included any reference to public policy or advocacy in that working definition. So for one reason or another, there's a lot of struggles to operationalize this desire to be at the public policy table. One person told me that funders have embraced public policy as critical, but that they're just struggling with what that looks like. Another told me that while her foundation knows that advocacy needs to be part of the puzzle, they're just in the initial stages of figuring out how to do that. And another person said that practice doesn't always keep pace with intent. So the struggle to turn intent into action comes from a variety of perceived obstacles. And the first was just a distaste for politics. As one person said, people are tired of politics, it takes the fun out of philanthropy. Another colleague said that politics can be seen as yucky. There was also a desire to maintain foundation's neutrality, which was seen as a real asset, giving them access to lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, and enabling them to be sort of a consistent voice across political changes. And they were afraid that they might jeopardize that access if they became too involved with political issues. Others talked about the need to satisfy diverse stakeholders, which could include board members and donors. And one funder said that his foundation was just currently in the process of assessing the comfort and gauging the stomach of our donors about engaging in some public policy work. And others talked about how community foundations and others that require ongoing fundraising from donors may feel a little bit less empowered in this area than those that don't need to do ongoing fundraising. And then others talked about a conflict between wanting to have this voice at the public policy table, but not wanting to drift too far away from their grant-making mission, and they referred to that as mission creep. And one of the folks said that they thought that if they dabbled too deeply into this, they might be misunderstood in terms of who they are and what their role is to be. Others, again, the idea of preference for funding programs that yield those quick results. People want to see the difference that they've made, as Aaron said. As one person told me, advocacy is not the warm fuzzy. For folks who want to deliver a check and see smiles on the faces of kids, nothing's going to replace that. And then that's compounded, again, by the challenges of measuring. And then, of course, there are the legal restrictions that came up again and again, concerns about lack of understanding of the tax laws, fears of jeopardizing tax-exempt status, and then concerns about that legal line between advocacy and lobbying. As one person said, it's scary and you don't want to get in trouble. There's just too much writing on it. But many of these are actually just perception issues, and there were ways that were identified in these interviews of how organizations have found a way to get around them or look at them differently. So I'm going to share a couple of examples. In some cases, all that's required to overcome these obstacles is just a change in the way that you perceive them. So for some, it requires a shift in mindset that allows us to imagine a world where these seemingly intractable problems may actually be solvable. And one participant cited advocacy as a key element in her foundation's work to, quote, challenge the paradigm of perpetuity, the notion that there will always be child abuse, for example, so that eventually we can reallocate resources to new issues that arise and start seeing some shift in outcomes that matter to us. Another person suggested that public policy can be reframed as a means to an end, and not saying that you are a foundation who exists for the purpose of engaging in public policy, just that it's a tool that you can use to achieve the program areas that you're already working on. And that's one way to avoid that issue of mission creep. It's just a tool in your toolbox. On evaluation, it's also an issue just reevaluating what you expect. As one person said, you just have to look at your evaluation differently. The typical numbers don't matter, like how many people did we serve. You have to look at the overall picture, and if you've moved the needle even this much in 3 years, that's fabulous. And then others said that they were actually advocating already, and they just had never thought of it that way. One person said that she's tried to explain to her board that they've always been involved in advocacy just by funding the nonprofits they're funding, by taking up their causes. And the example that she gave me was that they were working with a high school trying to increase high school graduation rates, and realized that the school bus schedule, or that the city buses were offset, so the kids were arriving at school late on a regular basis. So they went to the city and they had them shift the school bus schedule, the city bus schedule, so the kids were actually there when the bell rang. And then that's allowing their grant making in the schools to make a bigger impact. So it's eliminating a structural barrier. And then in terms of how to get buy-in from board, a couple of good suggestions came up. A few folks identified public policy or governmental relations committees as being a new structural element of their organizations, which they found can help ease boards into this conversation, that once there's a vehicle in place to have the conversation, they're actually ready to start talking about what issues it may apply to. So it's been a tool for integrating the work. And then it also provides a venue for talking about public-private partnerships as another excellent way to amplify your impact. And then one of the participants who had successfully guided her organization into this kind of work talked about the importance of, quote, telling the story correctly, doing the right education. And she actually, unprompted by me, gave the upstream-downstream parable suggestion as a way of talking to your board. She had found that that worked really well to help them see public policy and advocacy as a natural outcropping of the grant-making work that they were already doing. And another interviewee challenged us to say to our board members something like, if you think these issues are important enough to serve on a board and do your bit philanthropically, then they probably ought to be important enough to talk about publicly too. And then another strategy for overcoming this challenge is that really just by the using your stature in the community to convene, that's come up, that if you call a meeting, if you draw attention to an issue, people will come, the media will follow, and nonprofits are going to want to try to make those things happen for you. One example is the Read On Arizona program, which we're going to hear more about later from the Piper Trust, a literacy campaign that's really getting the conversation going statewide about the issue of early literacy. Also the DROP report on Latino students' educational outcomes. So those are ways that convening and publishing reports can actually just change the dialogue and rise issues to the top. And And one funder said, we have unique capital, yes, we have dollars, but we also have unique capital of connections, so we shouldn't just sit on it. And then a related way of drawing attention to an issue is to form coalitions. There's power in numbers, and it again can elevate the profile of an issue. And one person told me it's a way of basically saying to the legislature, here's this group of foundations all doing this work together. So while they don't necessarily have to speak to a particular bill, they are making their message known. And then lots of examples came up during my interviews. I want to share a few. Some are activities by foundations themselves. Others are examples of how foundations have catalyzed this work through their grantees. The American Trust, Steele Foundation, and others have coordinated major public education strategies around early childhood education during both the ballot initiative to create First Things First and then more recently to protect it. And while they didn't speak directly to the proposition, they were saying to the community, here's why we're investing in early childhood education. And then others had provided funding to the organizations that were working on the ground supporting those propositions, but were careful to make sure that we realized that they were supporting their general capacity and other operations. And Candace will talk a little bit more about how that's possible. And then the Arizona Foundation for Women had a successful campaign to increase public funding for domestic violence shelters. And they argued successfully that if philanthropy is putting this much of our resources, private resources, into this issue, so too should the public sector. And they also were able to reframe domestic violence as a public safety issue, which helped government see that as a role that they needed to be involved with as well. Others have funded a full-time position in state government dedicated to issues facing older adults as a way of really integrating that into the public policy framework, or funding trainings for judges on child welfare issues. Or funding groups that do explicit advocacy work around the environment. And again, there's a way of doing that where you're not funding that piece of their work, but you're supporting their general capacity. And then I just want to note that participants stressed almost across the board, this is not an either-or proposition. It's not as if we do public policy at the expense of helping people that are already in need. And that actually, these are complementary strategies that can help break down the barriers and amplify the impact of your grant making. And then I will go real quickly over this because we had a great overview of what's happening nationally, but just that sector-wide, there's a trend towards this. A 2010 survey by the Foundation Center of 1,300 funders found that 25% were engaging in some form of advocacy. These are some of the strategies that Erin's given great examples of. So hopefully this has just demonstrated that if you have concerns about this work, you're not alone, but that your peers nationally and in Arizona have found ways to overcome these obstacles. You'll hear a few more case studies this afternoon. The barrier that came up the most, and the one that I've said the least about, is related to legal restrictions, and I'll turn it over to Candace for that. But first, just wanted to share a resource that I found in my research that I found helpful. It's learnfoundationlaw.org, and it's a free online course that you can take. It was developed by legal staff at a number of major national foundations, and it focuses specifically on what advocacy-related activities foundations can do. And it goes beyond the obvious advice not to ask elected officials to vote yes on a particular bill, to some grayer areas like what you can talk about at a conference or a meeting if an elected official or their staff is there, or how to identify potential lobbying in a grant proposal that you receive. It takes about an hour to complete. It's well done, and I actually thought it was sort of fun, so it maybe will be helpful to you as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to Candace, our resident legal expert, to talk about how we can engage in public policy while staying within the confines of the law.